I'm sure if you're reasonably familiar with punk rock, you're aware of how vinyl still has a large following amongst the fan base, despite it going out of popularity in the eyes of most other genres years ago. Of course, other fan bases, like those of the metal and indie varieties, share a similar attachment to the medium, but personally, I would argue that vinyl has a stronger presence in the punk world, and at the very least, punk certainly has one of the most rabid vinyl collecting scenes in all of music. Either way, I'm sure you can imagine there's a lot of punk records out there that will go for ridiculous prices because of their rarity, sometimes even costing as much as 10 or 20 times their retail price, and in some cases even more. How's it going, folks? My name is Jack Miller. I am the incredibly underqualified punk historian, and as an avid vinyl collector myself, I've definitely spent quite a bit of money on some of the more hard-to-find records in my collection, and I'm sure a number of you have done the same. So I've decided to dedicate this video to some of the highest prices I've seen while searching for records on Discogs. That being said, I do want to give a little bit of a disclaimer by saying this is not a top 10 most expensive punk records of all time list. These are just a few of the more expensive finds I've come across when searching for records or doing research for one of my other videos. And lastly, if you are interested in weekly videos about punk rock, may I humbly ask that you please subscribe to my channel here. I'm having a lot of fun making these, and I want to make sure that all of you can keep having fun watching them. Anyways, for the first record on this list, we're going to dial our clocks back to the year 1988 with the original pressing of Screeching Weasel's second album, Boogada Boogada Boogada. There were two original releases for this record, the first being the famous Bright Pink American release through Roadkill Records. The original run counted 2,000 copies, the first 200 of which came with an insert that featured photos of the band bowling naked. The album was later released in Europe through the UK label Wet Spots Records and featured an album art unique to this release. The original US and UK releases also contained the bonus track Boogada on the A-side, which was a collection of sound bites pieced together into a single track. This Boogada track would not appear on any of the album's reissues later on. In terms of pricing, the US release of this record usually sells for around $160, and as of right now, the highest it's sold for is about $225. That being said, this record is naturally just going to keep getting more expensive with time, and with the only copy posted when I wrote this video priced at $255, I don't think anyone who owns this album in the current day is going to part ways with it for less than $200. Plus, factor in things like the original liner notes, or God forbid a copy turns up with the limited edition bowling inserts, and I wouldn't be surprised if this album hops up to the $270 to $300 range in the next few years. Even though this record has been repressed a number of times throughout the years, the reissues can still get pretty pricey. And if you want to get a copy of this record, you're probably going to be spending at least $45 to $50, unless you get really lucky. Next up, we're going to fast forward all the way to the early 2010s and step into the realm of horror punk for a second to take a look at Blitzkid's fourth full-length album, 5 Cellars Below. Although the original CD and digital release of the album came out in September 2006, the album would not be pressed on vinyl until October 2012 upon the band's first breakup. The first run consisted of 200 copies printed on a red translucent vinyl, and the second was limited to a mere 35 copies with a black and red design, both of which the band would sell during their final 2012 shows in Germany. The album would then receive 3 more pressings for the band's strong fan base in Germany, the first 2 being a translucent purple as well as a second run of the translucent red, and the third being another highly limited marble dark gray color. Just like everything else in Blitzkid's discography, 5 Cellars Below would not receive any kind of reissue during the band's dormant years from 2013 through 2018. However, upon their reunion in 2019, the album was reissued again. The first release came out in June and featured the original CD artwork on the LP with a standard black vinyl, while the second had a brand new candle album art and was pressed on a purple and gold one. Prices definitely vary depending on which version of this record you buy, but if this is an album you feel like you absolutely have to have in your collection, you're going to be spending at least $100. The original German releases from 2012 all average a little over $140, and the highest price one of them sold for in the past year was around $260. The first run of the 2019 US release generally goes for around $95 to $100 too, and as much as I'd love to provide data for the super limited editions of both the US and German pressings, none of them have actually ever been sold on Discogs. This record is a perfect example of the unfortunate reality with small cult favorite bands. There's only so many funds that the band has to work with, and vinyl is very much a financial commitment. Because of that, the records don't get pressed too often, and once they sell out, the resale value skyrockets pretty quickly. Up until Blitzkid's reunion, it was a similar story with their merch as well. As someone who's just as crazy for Blitzkid as he is for vinyl, this is a very depressing reality I've been coming to terms with ever since I got into collecting records, and there's definitely a small part of me that's tempted to drop a whole bunch of money I don't have on one of their albums. Moving on, we're gonna dial our clocks back to the late 80s once again and take a look at a cult favorite skate punk classic, RKL's Rock and Roll Nightmare. The album's original pressing was released through Alchemy Records in 1987 and included a comic-style lyric book. The album was also reissued in 1993 through Epitaph Records, but the comic was only included in the original 87 release. I think something that's also important to note here is that how much this record costs is also going to depend on where you live. RKL developed a much bigger fan base in Europe during the late 80s than they did in the US, so a great deal of their record sales took place overseas. This of course makes things a lot easier if you live somewhere like Germany or Italy, but a huge pain in the ass if you live in North America. Cheaper copies of the original pressing tend to float around the $60 to $80 range without factoring in shipping costs, but it's pretty rare you'll find this album priced at such a low amount. Plus, with how much it goes for on average, chances are the record's not in the best condition if it's being sold at that low a price. Generally speaking, the original pressing of this album typically goes for around $80 to $100, and if you have to factor in shipping costs to North America, it's probably going to look a little more like $110 to $125. Depending on the condition and whether or not it has the comic though, this record can go for even more, and the highest selling copy of Rock and Roll Nightmare on Discogs sold for almost $450. The 1993 reissues can get pretty expensive as well. The current median price on Discogs says about $40, but with the record only getting older and the fact that you'll probably be paying out the nose for it if you don't live in Europe, I'm willing to bet these days it's probably closer to $60 or $70. Fun fact about this album, I actually do own a copy of it, and this is the only record on this list here that I actually have in my possession. Unfortunately, mine did not come with the comic though. Next up on the list, we're going to push our clocks forward by about 11 years and dive ever so deep into the thriving ska punk scene of the late 90s with Less Than Jake's fan favorite record, Hello Rockview. The original run of this album in 1998 consisted of 6 different vinyl pressings, each with a standalone characteristic that set them apart from one another. The first and more or less standard pressing was done in a peach color and 2,300 copies were made. There were also 200 copies printed in pale blue and 300 done in a half clear, half blue color. The 1998 release was also printed on a yellow vinyl and a picture disc, as well as a box set of 7 individual 7-inches of the album's 14 tracks. Hello Rockview was reissued twice more in 2016 in several different colors. The first run consisted of 333 copies in an opaque red, 333 copies in opaque cyan blue, and 334 copies in half red, half cyan. Later that year, the record received 400 more copies in half yellow, half blue vinyl, along with 300 all yellow copies. Despite the shockingly large number of times this record has been pressed, there is a 0% chance you're going to get it for anything under $50. In the past, the original peach-colored pressing of this album has tended to sell for an average of $130, give or take a few, but as of late it tends to float a lot closer to the $180 mark more often than not. The yellow and blue copies of the album are usually a little less expensive, but still generally sell for around $100 for the blue and $80 for the yellow. And finally, the picture disc version and 7-inch box set both typically fall within the $90 range. Although again, as this record continues to age, these are all only going to get more and more valuable. The 2016 versions are of course a little less expensive, but are a lot less common. Nonetheless, both half and half copies as well as the 2016 yellow pressings all typically go for around $40 to $60 a pop. The opaque red and opaque blue versions from the same run were actually special edition handscreen records, and they were sold with special cardboard color sleeves. Because of that, these usually cost around $70 to $80. Less Than Jake is definitely a band with a super rabid fan base, and if I'm being honest, I'm kind of an example of that. After that, we have another 90s ska punk cult classic, Choking Victims' Squatta's Paradise 7-inch from 1996. This EP was only pressed once on vinyl, and thus its age and obscurity have earned it an extremely high price tag. The cheapest copy of this record to sell on Discogs in the past 12 months as of August 2021 costed the buyer $60 even, and the price has steadily grown ever since. As of right now, Squatta's Paradise hasn't sold since February 2021, but its most recent sale went for just $100, and with its only current listing on Discogs priced at $200, I have a feeling this record might skyrocket price-wise in the next few years. Choking Victims' other 2 7-inches generally go for pretty high prices as well, but not quite as much as Squatta's Paradise. The self-titled one from 94 typically sells for about $75 to $85, and the Victim Comes Alive EP from 98 generally goes for around $50 to $60. The reason for this is probably because of the unique artwork in the Squatta's Paradise liner notes, some of which was drawn by the band members themselves. I've done an entire video on the story of Choking Victim and Leftover Crack, so if you're interested, I'll link that in the description below. If you're thinking this record doesn't sound as expensive as the others I've mentioned, keep in mind it isn't even a full 12-inch EP we're talking about here. It's this big! For our next album on the list, we'll be returning to 1980s SoCal with Black Flag's classic release, Damaged. This fine piece of history here was originally released on November 16th, 1981 through SST Records. Of course, this here is a record that's been reissued a million times over, and I certainly didn't pay any more than $25 for my copy, but as I'm sure you can imagine, the original pressing from 1981 can go for a pretty fat stack of cash. The very first issue of this record typically sells for around $220 to $240 on average, and for a few months in a row last year, it consistently sold for $300 a piece. As of late, however, it seems to be dropping in value, and lately it's been selling closer to the $200 mark. Before we move on though, I do also want to mention that the 1982 reissue of this LP can bring in some high numbers as well, averaging around $97 and selling at a high point for $155 in March of 2021. Regardless of which version we're talking about though, I have to say this is a lot of money to drop on a record you could really get an identical copy of for 20 bucks at your local record shop. So now that we're past the number 5 mark, we're going to take a look at some even pricier LPs. The first of which is none other than Victim in Pain, the debut album of New York hardcore godfathers Agnostic Front. Much like Black Flag's Damaged, Victim in Pain has been reissued a lot, but with how many rabid vinyl collectors there are in the hardcore scene, this record on average is easily worth double what Damaged is. The average selling price of the original 1984 release from the past 3 years is a little over $470, reaching a low point of $100 in 2019 and a high point of $950 this past January. The record's first reissue from 1985 is also worth a whopping $312 on average and sold at a high point of $417 in late 2019. The price seems to be on a steady rise once more for both copies, the original selling for just under $525 and the 85 reissue for $350 this past winter. I wouldn't be surprised if this album starts selling for at least $1,000 on average in the next 5 to 10 years. A lot of the reissues from recent years tend to sell for pretty high prices as well, depending on which one it is. For example, the self-release reissue from 2019 goes for about $225 on average, peaking at $282 in October of 2019. In all honesty, Victim in Pain is just an expensive buy no matter what, and regardless of which version it is, you're going to be spending at least $80. After that, we have another 7-inch EP, but this time it's the debut of the California skate punk pioneers, Bad Religion. As I'm sure some of you know, this was not only Bad Religion's first official release, but was also the first release on Epitaph Records, and the 7-inch debuted in February of 1981. On average, this record sells for about $766, but it has fluctuated in price over the years. It hit its first high point in late 2017 when it sold for $1,000, but then floated back down to the $650 to $700 range before spiking back up again in early 2020. Then come this record's 40th anniversary in February 2021, the record sold for $1,000 once more, and another time after that in April. Seeing as this record did just hit its 40th anniversary and certainly isn't getting any younger, I have a feeling it's going to stay in the thousands for the next few years. That is until it climbs up into the 2000s. Bad Religion's debut EP has of course been reissued a number of times, but the only other copy that usually sells for over $100 is the 12-inch reissue from 1984 that was retitled The Original Bad Religion. Other copies of this 7-inch were pressed in the 2010s and are still pretty readily available, and most of these versions can be found for $15 to $30. Just like with the Black Flag record though, I really don't see the point in spending $1,000 for a record you could get for $20 that's probably in better condition anyway. But you know, to each their own. I got a comment from one of my regulars on this channel saying I should do a video on Bad Religion, and I just want to say to any fans that might be watching, that's something that will very much happen in the future. I'm actually in the process of reading their book right now, and I'll be writing the video sometime after I finish it. Next up, we have what I think is actually the most interesting release on the whole list, Coxbar's debut self-titled from 1978. And just in case you might be wondering, no, I'm not talking about the original pressing of Shock Troops. Coxbar's debut record actually predates Shock Troops by 3 years, and oddly enough, it was only released in Spain during its first run in '78. The album wouldn't be released on vinyl in the UK until 1987, and the reissue was given a new album cover and retitled as True Grit. The original Spanish pressing goes for roughly $638 on average, and the price has been on a steady rise for the past couple years. The record sold at a high point of $774 this past February in 2021, and like all of these records, it's only gonna go up as time goes on. On the other hand, the UK reissue from '87, True Grit, tends to go for closer to $50 to $60, and although this is certainly still a high price for a record, it's not nearly as much as the $700 original pressing. This record also received a number of different unofficial reissues in 2020 and 2021, and although these reissues aren't the most readily available thing, they tend to sell at more affordable prices. So if this is an album you feel like you need to have, I'd recommend going that route. Shock Troops is easily in my top 20 punk records of all time, and I've been meaning to dive a little deeper into Coxbar anyway. So let me know in the comments if you'd be interested in seeing a video about those guys too. And in our number 2 spot, we have the oh-so-famous first two Minor Threat 7-inches from 1981. I'm sure most of us who are vinyl collectors probably own these in some form or another, and most likely on some version of the self-titled compilation of the two, but have you ever wondered how much the original pressings of the actual 7-inches go for? The first of these EPs was titled Filler and was released 5 different times through Discord Records during its original run. The Filler 7-inch also would feature the artwork that would be later used for the self-titled compilation. The album art was originally printed in a bright red shade for its first 2 runs, but would also later be reissued in blue, yellow, and green as well. On average, an original red copy of this EP sells for about $1,300 and sold at a high point of $1,773 in April of 2020. The yellow and green copies tend to sell within the $730 range, and the blue copies usually cost around $540. The second of these EPs is the In My Eyes 7-inch and features the 4 final tracks on the more widely known comp. A copy of this EP from its first official run will typically sell for a little over $1,100, but it has sold for a whopping $2,000 in 2017 for a copy in near mint condition. Although prices seem to fluctuate quite a bit with this one, with the current listing being priced at $2,000 now, I have a hunch it's probably going to stay up there. The In My Eyes 7-inch also received 2 reissues in 1982, and copies of the reissues tend to sell around the $510 to $520 mark. There's also a handful of misprint copies of this record floating around out there, and although only one of them has ever sold on Discogs, the person who bought it paid $2,500. Before we get to number 1, I want to bring up a couple records that I've decided are honorable mentions. The first of these honorable mentions is Slick Shoes' full-length from 1999, Burnout. This record was actually never pressed on vinyl when it first dropped and was released on LP for the first time ever in January of 2020 through People of Punk Rock Records. This album tends to sell for around $75 to $80 on Discogs, but with that price tag, it's not quite expensive enough to make the list. It's mainly on here because I'm still salty that I didn't jump on it when it first came out, and it sold out super fast. The second honorable mention here is the infamous NoFX EP, The Decline, and specifically the limited edition clear vinyl version. This record had already been selling for around $800 before 2021, so it really had the credentials to make it onto the list. But the reason I have it as an honorable mention is because this past 420, some high idiot went and bought the thing for $2,500. This of course blew the average way out of proportion, and now the record is probably going to sell for a lot more than it used to. So thanks, dude. I sure hope you didn't spend your rent money on that. And last but not least, the number 1 slot on this list goes to the original Misfits 7-inch from 1977. The 7-inch was released through Blank Records and contains just a single track on either side. The A-side features a song called Cough Cool, and the B-side the more famous track She. This record has received a number of bootleg re-releases, but never an official one, and copies of the original pressing can go for obscene amounts of money. Though it doesn't show up on Discogs very often, when it does, it typically sells for around $3,000 to $3,500. That being said, in January of 2021, a copy in near mint condition surfaced from the vaults and sold for $10,877. That's almost $11,000 for a 2-song 7-inch. I understand that some people who are super into collecting have the funds to set aside a great deal of money for the cause, but spending $11,000 for a 2-song EP is just a little sad if you ask me. Thinking of all the things I could do with $11,000 just makes me cringe a little that someone blew that much money on a piece of plastic, regardless of its historical meaning. Whatever their reasoning was, I sure hope for their sake they were satisfied with their purchase. Well, I'd say that wraps up our list of 10 absurdly expensive punk records. I hope y'all don't mind me trying something a little different this week. I have to say though, I actually could not believe the prices on some of these records when I first saw them. But that's enough for me. I want to hear what you guys have to say. Are you a vinyl collector? If so, what are the top 3 albums you own? It doesn't have to be punk. Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you next time.